So what do these people have in common? We have Susan B. Anthony, Jane Addams, Frederick Douglass, Thomas Paine, Marion Maston, Ida B. Wells, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Got some fun facts about each of them. Susan B. Anthony was arrested for illegally voting in a presidential election. She fought for women to have the right to own property. She persuaded the University of Rochester to admit women, and she was the first woman to appear on a U.S. coin. Does anybody remember who else was the other U.S. woman to appear on a coin? Sacagawea. It's the only other one to ever appear on a U.S. coin. Jane Addams. Anybody know anything about her?
Nope.
Nope? Well, she was known for working with poor. You've heard of Hull House? That was one of her endeavors. She won a Nobel Prize, a Peace Prize. She attended medical school, and she was the founder for the American Civil Liberties Union. Frederick Douglass, he was a former slave who taught himself how to read and write. He recruited African Americans for the Union Army, and he was nominated for vice president. Thomas Paine, actually an Englishman, but he moved to the U.S. at the urging of Benjamin Franklin, and his work Common Sense helped to issue and create a Declaration of Independence. He was also the personal assistant to Nathaniel Greene of the Continental Army, and George Washington used Paine's words to rally the troops during the Revolutionary War. Marion Maston, he was a merchant. He did office and clerical work. He was a teacher. He worked the telegraph, and he was a politician. Ida B. Wells started the first African American kindergarten in Chicago. She lied about her age to become a teacher at the age of 16. And she was dragged from a train car for refusing to give up her seat. She paid for first class and she was going to sit there. So she even beat out Mrs. Parks. She also worked as a journalist, writing about unjust lynchings of blacks. Elizabeth Cady Stanton refused to have the word obey in her wedding vows. And she wrote speeches for Susan B. Anthony. She was the first woman to run for Congress, and she tried to donate her brain to science, but her children wouldn't honor her wishes. But they all have one thing in common, even with all those differences. They were all committed to the right to vote for women. Voting matters because it allows us to have a say in how our government is run and how changes are made at every level. Women's fight for the right to vote developed from a desire to help the family and their communities and to participate in making everything available for the families. Suffrage became a statewide issue in Indiana, and it took the efforts of women from all walks of life, all over the state, all skin colors, all economic levels, to gain that right. Hoosier women were active in working for the right to vote by attending meetings, campaigns, And they did all this while pushing for bills and amendments, and they overcame defeat over and over, but they were very stubborn in what they wanted, and they were not going to give up. Due to the events I'm going to talk about, and the continuing pressure of not only women, but some men too, the 14th Amendment came, wait a minute, on the wrong slide. Due to the events and continuing pressure of the 14th Amendment that was passed in 1868, women were guaranteed certain rights, individuals were guaranteed certain rights, but only to an extent. They were allowed to vote if they were born and naturalized in the United States, but they still didn't have 100% voting rights, because voting rights were determined by the states. So the federal government wasn't going to step on the states' rights. Didn't want to cause a problem back then. By 1866, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had formed the American Equal Rights Association, and they decided they were going to fight for suffrage and universal coverage for everyone, not just women, but men, black people, because everybody was experiencing the same problem. They weren't given rights and speaking their thoughts for the government. The 14th Amendment debate was still going on 20 years later, but there was a divide between the blacks and the whites, just like there is today. And the suffrage movement at that time went through a division, and it caused two different factions to form. The first one was the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was more radical. They would fight more for blacks' rights and men's rights. And then there was the American Women's Suffrage Association, which focused more on just women. They were considered the conservative group. In 1878, the Women's Suffrage Amendment was proposed to Congress, and it was proposed as an amendment, not a bill. They wanted it in the Constitution. But now that the suffrage movement was split, they didn't have as much traction, even though they pressed forward with their agenda. Almost another 10 years passed before they were able to get anywhere with Congress. In 1881, Indiana became more progressive in the movement. The state took up the national political scene, and the General Assembly tried to pass an amendment to the state constitution, allowing women the right to vote. The problem being with Indiana law was that an amendment to the Constitution had to go through 2 additional rounds in Congress before it could be passed as an amendment. In 1883, which would have been the second year, the anti-suffragists decided that they were going to block it, so the bill didn't pass and become an amendment. It wasn't until 1887 that it came back to the federal government, and it was defeated at that level. So the suffrage movement kind of was at a standstill for a while. A few years later, in 1890, the suffrage groups decided to reconcile their differences. They felt like they were working for a common goal, and that's what they should be doing. In 1890, they remerged to form the National Women's Suffrage Association, because together they were stronger than they were apart. They had kept going, but they just weren't able to get anywhere. By the mid-1890s, the black members of the suffrage movement felt that, yes, they were going forward, but they weren't quite getting enough traction for the blacks. So people like Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Harriet Tubman, and other famous black ladies mostly, formed the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs so that they could meet, discuss, and push forward their agenda too. About 30 years passed, and then the women of Indiana hadn't forgotten how close they had come to getting their amendment passed. So in 1911, they formed the Women's Franchise League of Indiana, and they started making more and more progress in Indiana, to such a point that on March 3rd, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated, and for the first time in the women's suffrage movement, groups from all over the country, including Indiana, marched on Washington, D.C., demanding to be heard. And this is a group from Hebron, Indiana, that were part of the suffrage movement. Even though the suffrage movement kind of had been at a standstill for a few years, there was a thing that they didn't push too hard on, but it was out there that even though they couldn't vote, there was nothing in the law that said a woman couldn't run for office. So in 1916, Jeanette Rankin from Montana ran for the House of Representatives and won. It took her 2 years before she was able to open a debate on women's suffrage. And for the first time in 20 years, it was being heard at the national level. So right here is where we're going to return to the Indiana level. The suffrage movement, even though it had been going on nationally for many, many years and had done a little bit in Indiana, Indiana was a relatively young state. Didn't have much influence. So a small town like South Whitley would have even less influence, you would think. But we did play a very important role. The road to suffrage in Indiana began on December 15th, 1856, in Ohio, of all places. And I can't pronounce the county.
Coshocton.
Coshocton. Says my friend up in the back. When Marion Maston was born, he was the sixth in a line of 11 children. His father was a farmer, as a lot of people are in Indiana and Ohio. But he did something that not all families were able to do. He sent all of his children to school, even though they were probably expected to work alongside him at the farm. It's interesting to note too that in 1856, it's only 8 years after the Women's Suffrage Convention in Seneca Falls. So Marion would have had years after the defeat of the first suffrage bill growing up. He was hearing all this stuff going on. And with his father being the farmer he was and having all those children, some of them being girls, he still paid for them to go to school. Which, to send all your children to school is unusual enough, because you had to pay for each and every child, because you had to pay the teacher's salary. And once children usually learn to read, they left school. 55% of children of ages 5 to 15 were all that usually attended the school. But in that family, they continued through school even after that age. And at some point between 1870 and 1880, the Maston family moved to Indiana, to Kosciuszko County. I can say that one. And they continued farming, and the children continued going to school, even the girls. Marion continued to go to school, but when he turned 20, he didn't want to farm anymore, so he went to Valparaiso University. Took him 2 years, and he received his teaching degree. Boy, I wish teaching degrees came that easy these days. But he continued his teaching career in Whitley County and Porter County schools. And in August 12, 1883, Marion married Roselva May Stewart. I know I probably massacred her name. She went by Rose. But they got married in Whitley County, and they stayed in Whitley County. Matter of fact, they made their home in South Whitley. The home is located on South Main Street, just down from the Baptist Church a few houses, and it's now on the historic register. By the way, the picture of the kitchen, I'm sure, is not what it used to look like. The woodwork probably is still original. Over the next 7 years, Marion and his wife welcomed 3 children to the family. There was Neva, who was born in 1885. Glenn came along later in 1887, and Florence in 1890. I'm not sure what happened with Glenn and Florence, but I do know that Neva stayed around. As a matter of fact, as a side note, Marion's great-granddaughter, Barbara Ann, went to school here and still lives nearby in Fort Wayne. And there's a family connection there, but I won't go into it because it's rather confusing. Marion was a Renaissance man of his time. He couldn't make a living just teaching, so he had to have another job. He went into telegraph business and worked for the Nickel Plate Railroad until 1895. I had mentioned he was also in the retail business. The picture there on your left was his hardware business. It was located where the Kent Theater used to stand, for those of you from South Whitley. He had the hardware working on the first floor, and the Pythian sisters met on the second floor. And he ran the business, along with having other jobs, until he died in 1940. After his death, the family sold the business to the Joe Huffman and Royce Deaton family. And those families both lived there in the store until they bought their farms outside of town. That building happened to burn down in 1943. The building that the Huffman and Deaton families had bought is the picture there on the right, which was one spot down from where the original store had been. The Deatons and Huffmans ran the store until just recently. Does anybody know exactly when they went out of business? I can't remember. But the original location for the store was purchased by Don LeBrun, where he built the Kent Theater and it opened in 1947. Unfortunately, the Kent Theater also burnt down. And that little house next door is still standing. So it has a hearty life. Marion was into organized things. He was a member of the Methodist Church. I'm assuming that was the Methodist church he attended. There were, what, 3, 4 of them? Because as it moved around town. He was also a member of the South Whitley Independent Order of the Oddfellows. And he belonged to the Columbia City Lodge 189. He was also active in politics in the Whitley County area over the years. He held the office of Whitley County Treasurer from 1908 to 1912. He was a member of the local school board. And maybe it was in these early years that he became interested in education and the suffrage movement, as he saw how his sisters were allowed to go to school. But by the time he became active in politics, he had become a friend of the suffrage movement. Eventually, he was elected to politics at the state level, and he served in the Senate of the Indiana government. He was elected for the first term in 1915 to 1917 when he was 59 years old. And then he ran for re-election from 1917 to 1919. While he was in his first term in 1915, he introduced a bill for the women's suffrage movement. It didn't pass, but he vowed to bring it back. During his second term in 1917, there were 2 bills heard for the women's suffrage movement. The first was the Beardsley Full Suffrage Amendment, which was proposed as a full suffrage through an amendment to the Constitution. It was never adopted, possibly from fear of being a repeat of the First Amendment. But Marion introduced a bill with partial suffrage with mixed results. His partial suffrage bill would only allow women to vote in municipal elections, such as school and special elections, but it was a step in the right direction. With pressure from national leadership and support from suffrage in both Republican and Democratic groups, both houses worked quickly to push the partial suffrage bill through with a vote of 67 to 24. But it wasn't completely without contention. Marion had requested the bill be heard by the Rights and Privileges Committee. The bill on prohibition that had gone through the same year had been heard by them, so he figured that was an easier way to get it through. However, there was a committee called the Judiciary B Committee, and contrary to what Marion wanted, the Lieutenant Governor, last name Bush, I don't know if he's any relation, assigned the bill to the Judiciary Committee, since it didn't like suffrage. When he was arguing for his bill, Marion asked the legislature to vote favorably and not to leave Indiana behind, because the national movement has picked up speed by that time. The opponents of the bill were concerned. They said thousands of colored women would be given the right to vote if they passed it. But in reply, Marion said, if this is the only objection, it should be passed without hesitation. He didn't care if they were black, white, or anything else. He felt like women deserved the right to vote. When the bill passed, women across the state, and specifically in Monroe County, celebrated the good news. And they began to prepare for the elections. But the progress was short-lived. The opponents to the women's suffrage bill struck out again a critical blow. On August of 1917, William Knight of Indianapolis filed a lawsuit, and he alleged that the law went against the Indiana Constitution of Article 2, Section 2, which restricted votes to male citizens alone. He also asked for restraining orders to cause women who tried to register to vote, because he considered it unconstitutional and a burden on the taxpayers. So on September 17th, Judge Rockford of the Marion Superior Court ruled that the law was unconstitutional. The suffragists immediately appealed to the state Supreme Court, but on October 26, 1917, the Supreme Court agreed, and they ruled the bill unconstitutional. It was a very hard blow for the Indiana suffragists. And news of the defeat spread quickly. The National Women's Party newsletter worried that the Indiana decision would have an immediate effect on the suffrage movement across all the other states. Even with those setbacks at the state level in 1917, and again at the federal level, because the U.S. government failed to pass a federal amendment in 1918, women kept pushing forward with their goal in mind. It was a final wave of pressure from the suffragists that the U.S. Congress finally approved the 19th Amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. Indiana became the 26th state to ratify it on January 16th, 1920. That amendment went into effect on August 26th, 8 days after the 2/3 majority of ratification had been achieved. That was probably a big day for celebration of the Maston household. Marion never left South Whitley. He died here on March 16th, 1940, and his wife followed him on July 24th, 1941. They're both buried in the South Whitley Cemetery on the south side of town by the schools. Kind of fitting, since that's where he spent most of his time. Is there any questions?